Welcome everyone, I'm Dr. Donald Wallenfang. This live stream is entitled Paul Ricoeur and the Labyrinth of Language. We want to understand Paul Ricoeur, how his phenomenology is different than that of Edmund Husserl, Martin Heidegger, but very much indebted to them. And what is meant by this phrase, labyrinth of language? This is a very symbolic term here. It refers nothing to what might be called New Age movement or anything like this, but refers to the complexities of language within the method of phenomenology. So when we have a given phenomenon, even though we want to get to the purity of the thing that gives itself as itself, there are inevitable hermeneutical layers involved in the human subject's uptake of the phenomenon. And that is what I mean here by labyrinth, not in the sense of a multi-cursal or bicursal kind of maze with dead ends and things, but instead in terms of a unicursal movement to the center point of truth and meaning and meaningfulness, but especially and above all, truth. But to get there, it is a journey. There is a route, and Paul Ricoeur teaches us the long route of the art of interpretation. So we want to think along with Ricoeur in terms of how phenomenology looks and where his points of emphasis are, how he's similar yet different to Husserl and Heidegger. So for Ricoeur, we want to think about what we might call phenomenality, how phenomena give themselves to human subject. And it's always important to remember this fundamental relationship. So the human subject in relation to the phenomenon, the thing itself, giving itself to the human subject. And again, there are two primary things happening here. The phenomenon gives itself to the human subject, and we could say in terms of what is most original, what is most decisive for this encounter with the phenomenon is what the phenomenon is giving. And again, this is called givenness through intuition. And for Husserl, he wanted to get at the purity of pure phenomenal giving and pure intuition, these immanent data, essential data within consciousness. So the phenomenon gives itself to the human subject, who becomes conscious of the thing itself, giving itself all the way into the heart of subjectivity. For Kant, he drew a distinction between the noumenon, the thing in itself, and the phenomenon, the thing as it appeared to the human subject. But Husserl says this caesura, this hiatus, this gap between noumenon and phenomenon is unwarranted, but we have a unity of givenness to the human subject. But Paul Ricoeur is especially investigating this other movement called intentionality. That is the subjective uptake and interpretation of the phenomenon as it gives itself, including what Heidegger calls the Umwelt of the very encounter. As Paul Ricoeur says, every phenomenon is enmeshed within a density of texts, a density of meanings. So we have given phenomenon given through intuition, and yet the human subject's intentionality approaching the phenomenon, receiving the phenomenon, interpreting the phenomenon, and describing the phenomenon. So we want to talk about this process as Ricoeur envisages it in this live stream. So we want to go to Ricoeur's work, Hermeneutical Theory of Paul Ricoeur, in his book Hermeneutics and the Human Sciences, as well as Figuring the Sacred, the Symbolism of Evil, these kind of texts of Ricoeur, the conflict of interpretations. So Ricoeur emphasizes that intentionality over against elemental intuition. That is Husserl's obsession. For Ricoeur, he writes, and this is in Symbolism of Evil, the symbolic manifestation of a thing is a matrix of symbolic meanings as words, wherein manifestation and meaning are strictly contemporaneous and reciprocal. So if we go back to the diagram of phenomenality, what Ricoeur is saying here is that the givenness of the phenomenon is also called manifestation. This movement here, the phenomenon giving itself to the human subject, gives itself in intuition by manifesting itself, showing itself. So we have intuition and the manifestation of the phenomenon. Itself manifests itself to the interpreter. But the human being as interpreter receives the manifestation as meaning, and that is a function of intentionality. So Paul Ricoeur is saying here that manifestation and meaning, intuition and intentionality are contemporaneous with each other and form a unity and a reciprocity. So much manifestation, so much meaning, so much interpretation, so much intuition. So we have this whole other side of things that Husserl works so hard to bracket for the sake of the purity of the phenomenon. But Paul Ricoeur, again, in a kind of Kantian retrieval, comes back to what about intentionality and how meaning is formulated symbolically, linguistically, historically, particularly. What gives is also the question, what means for Paul Ricoeur? And he would say, no meaning, no givenness. No legible meaning, no logical meaning, no intelligible meaning, no receptivity of givenness. So givenness is received to the degree that it is recognized and interpreted. This is the emphasis of Paul Ricoeur over and against Husserl's pursuit of the pure phenomenological giving of the thing itself. And this is not only the case for a symbol phenomenon per se, but for Ricoeur, the cosmos itself is saturated with symbolic meanings. And Paul Ricoeur talks about this in his book, Figuring the Sacred. And this commentary is based, again, on my 2017 book, Dialectical Anatomy of the Eucharist, an Etude in Phenomenology, forward by Jean-Luc Marion. But this book deals with especially the work of Marion, Ricoeur, and Levinas. And so I want to take some time to really think along with Paul Ricoeur and how he fills out our understanding of how phenomenology works. So a phenomenon becomes manifest insofar as it is rendered as such verbally. So again, going back to the diagram, givenness is talked about in Husserl and Heidegger's German as gibt. So this whole event of self-manifestation of the phenomenon is also signified by the term es gibt, which means literally in English, it gives. So the phenomenon gives itself to a self, giving the self to itself, but also we have this meaning aspect. So it's not just es gibt, but es gibt als, we say in German, as. And this is what's called the phenomenological as, that a phenomenon doesn't give itself in its bare elemental manifestation without any meaning. But the phenomenon is received by the human subject to the degree that it means something. It doesn't just give something, but it means something. So this is where Heidegger says, again in German, the phenomenon etwas, something, als etwas, the as, the phenomenological as, the phenomenon as something gives itself as something. It has a definite decipherable meaning that it's giving, not just some like radiance, refulgence of light that we don't know what it means, but it comes with meaning. So manifestation and meaning are contemporaneous and reciprocal, Paul Ricoeur says. So the movement of the es gibt into the es gibt aus through subjective interpretation of the phenomenon. So while phenomena may give themselves, while they may give meanings that are in principle univocal, and this is what Husserl is after, univocal meanings, univocal givenness, immanent data of consciousness, universal objective meanings. So they give these kind of meanings, yes, but at the same time, these meanings, Ricoeur says, quoting from Hermeneutics and the Human Sciences, these meanings of phenomena, they do not immediately reveal their univocity. They must, in Husserl's terms, be submitted to the work of elucidation. In German, Aufklärung. We already have this with Kant, and this movement within the Western Enlightenment is very rational. And it's this wanting to come clean with things in themselves, our acts of interpretation, also in how we understand a thing in a way that is not pure naivete. So we're going to talk about the movement, this Ricoeurian hermeneutic schema movement from first naivete through critique to second naivete to appropriation. But what he's saying here is that there is a necessary process of elucidation, and that has to do here with the intentionality of the subject. This is the zone of the Aufklärung in German, the clearing up, the sorting out of one meaning from another. When we receive phenomena and interpret phenomena, and as Marion talks about, saturated phenomena give themselves to us, we're not just drowning in a deluge of manifestation. If that were the case, there would be absolutely nothing to say, no philosophical work to be done. We may be in a kind of state of mystical contemplation or something with some kind of sensation, but even sensation for the subject has meaning about it. What type of sensation is it? Is it pleasant or painful, for example? And we don't even have to use words to interpret a sensation as a particular one. So we need to have an Aufklärung, an elucidation of meaning that comes right along with the manifestation of the phenomenon. However, Ricoeur and Husserl differ on how this elucidation transpires. Husserl insists, to quote from his work, The Idea of Phenomenology, that phenomenology does not create, but only finds. That's very Husserlian. Phenomenology doesn't create. The human subject doesn't create, only receives, only finds, only discovers. But in Ricoeur's estimation, phenomenology seeks to go beyond a static description of experience, a mere geography of the layers of meaning, and through intentional explication, Ricoeur goes so far as to say, we create meanings. We receive univocal, universal meanings, but we also synthesize and integrate them, and thereby generate them. Every encounter with a phenomenon is a new event of meaning, Ricoeur says. And we have something to do with that meaning coming into the light, coming to surface. The process of fashioning these new meanings is a fourfold route that begins with naive description and ends or begins anew with appropriation of meaning. And we want to outline that process now. As Ricoeur lays it out in his work, this Ricoeurian hermeneutic schema, where we move from first naivete to second naivete through the moment of critique, many moments of critique, and all the way to an ethical appropriation of the original event of meaning. So Ricoeur talking about a hermeneutic schema that has 4 steps for Ricoeur. We want to follow these. We want to think along with him on this. So the first step for Ricoeur is some kind of understanding that we bring to the lived experience. And every new experience, we have a current understanding of things, an understanding of the world. And for Husserl, this understanding is problematic in as much as it is a natural attitude that prevents a greater opening and dilation of perception in relation to phenomena that would give themselves to the human subject. And so this understanding phenomenology works to bracket. And the same is true for Ricoeur. With this understanding, he also specifies it as a pre-understanding because it's going to change over the course of the interaction between the self and the phenomenon. He also calls it first naivete. We come to experience a bit naive. There's a kind of underlying, perhaps feigned innocence that we bring to the experience. And when we encounter phenomena, it's this that ends up being shaken up, in as much as we move into the second step of critique. And in the name of Husserl, his battle cry, zu den Sachen selbst, to the things themselves, Paul Ricoeur says, among these things are the hermeneutical layers of interpretation of subjectivity, in order that phenomenology not become its own fundamentalism of this pure ego in relation to the pure phenomena. We have to deal with hermeneutics, the process of interpretation. Otherwise, the method lacks a purity that can have, through a paradoxical bracketing, first of the natural attitude, but also of the ensuing attitude of phenomenological purity that we would have with Husserl. So it's a double bracketing that goes on through critique, not just once, twice, 1,000 times, indefinitely, over and over. So part of critique involves explanation, explication, which is part of the evidence of receptivity. We gather up the evidence also of subjectivity, of the interpreting agency of the human subject. Explication, interpretation, elucidation. To become more lucid is to account for how we're interpreting phenomena. Distanciation between the original event of receiving the phenomenon as it resurfaces in memory. We come back to it, we might experience it again, And there's a distanciation between that originary manifestation and meaning making that comes through this act of interpretation. Also included in critique are hermeneutics of suspicion. Why we might interpret something a certain way, perhaps out of self-interest. This is also part of bracketing the natural attitude. How much self-interest is charged in the interpretation is up here in pre-understanding as I approach the world of givenness. And also demythologization, where we reify so many values and things, the ego itself, and the ego has to be demythologized. There needs to be a Copernican revolution that brings us to greater clarity. The Aufklärung happens here through critique, a greater clarity of what is the case, of what, not only what gives, but what means with univocal and universal clarity. So we can call this movement having to do with the labyrinth of language and all of the linguistic things we have to attend to through this process of critique that brings us to the third stage, which Ricoeur calls, again, understanding. But it's a different understanding than simply the pre-understanding with which we began in this first naivete. But through critique, through the gauntlet of critique, the labyrinth of critique, we arrive at a second naivete, that is a maturation of understanding and a more true understanding of things, a more balanced, tempered, global, holistic understanding of things. Not just this narrow, myopic, limited understanding that we begin with here. If we don't submit this pre-understanding to critique, this is what is called fundamentalism of one kind or another. It's being overconfident in what one already knows, and perhaps believing that one has nothing more to learn, nothing more to discover, nothing more to research. But we risk revision and reform through the act of research that involves a critique of the pre-understanding we bring to a given question. This is why it's important to let the questions lead within this labyrinth of language that is involved in critique, and arrival at a second naivete that will lead us then to a mature place of appropriation. From the Latin root proprius, that means one's own. So to appropriate the phenomenon, the original event of meaning, is to make it one's own, is to decipher between true and false, yes and no, yes sometimes as both and. One truth does not make another truth, does not disqualify another truth. One truth doesn't necessarily mean another truth alongside, that they're mutually exclusive. But appropriation allows us to embody, incorporate the meanings that come through this labyrinth of language into an ethical response. Appropriation signifies the arrival of the ethical. If we're just dealing with understanding and critique, perhaps we never move past the theoretical. But with appropriation, Heidegger's Ereignis, the event of appropriation of meaning, and for Heidegger, Sein's self-manifestation, we have the movement toward a more authentic way of living, a more truthful way of living, a more courageous way of living, and a more martyr's way of living, that of the witness. One becomes a witness, moving from the pre-understanding all the way into this event of appropriation. We enter the realm of the ethical. So if we think more about these steps, the first step, this first naivete, signifies the immediacy of belief, literal and direct renderings of texts at face value, primitive assimilation of symbols, pre-critical consciousness. And this is where a person takes too much for granted in this pre-understanding. And so this is a problem for truth. It's a confusion oftentimes, confusing the whole for one of its parts, one or some of its parts. To confuse the part for the whole is to remain locked in some kind of natural attitude, some kind of egocentric self-insulation to the storm of critique. But someone who is sincere about seeking the truth is not afraid of critique, and they realize this is a necessary path to tread in order to arrive at the prize. And so I think the concept of Labyrinth, for instance, as a literary form, as an artistic form, with reference to Greek mythology, for instance, where you have the character Theseus, who risks entering the labyrinth in pursuit of the Minotaur. He's not afraid to confront the monster face to face. And he enters the labyrinth. There's only one way in and one way out. And it's Adriana's thread who helps him find his way out. And so Adriana's thread is woven throughout this process for Ricoeur. We dare to enter the labyrinth because we're not simply living in defense of our own fundamentalism. We're living in pursuit of the truth. And in this game, we have the ball and we're moving our way to the end zone. We're working our way to the goal line. And we're not afraid of critique. We're not afraid of exposing our half-baked ideas and conclusions. We want to gather up more evidence. And this is Husserl too. We are committed to the evidence of truth that comes through the objectivity of phenomenal self-givenness, but at the same time is received through this process of critical thinking, moving to a critical second naivete understanding, where now I understand something better than I did before. And that's why I take the class, and that's why I complete the degree, and that's why I go to the library for hours and pull all the books off the shelf on the topic and peruse them and sift through them and gather up the evidence that's coming from a community of learners here. And it's much more than Googling something and reading whatever links first pop up. This is the patient process, Paul Ricoeur says, of explication and elucidation. Explication and elucidation. I remember at Loyola University Chicago having class with the wonderful professor Mark McIntosh, belated, we miss him very much, Mark McIntosh. And I studied with him history of Christian theology, and we had to do these assignments in class, text elucidation. So I remember doing an assignment on Origin of Alexandria, text elucidation of Origin, and that always stuck with me. Just this important task of being to think along with someone else, to think along with their argument, his or her argument, and understand what they mean. And when you elucidate someone else's text, you're submitting your own pre-understanding to a critique, simply trying to listen to the other and learn more from him or her. And then the most exciting moment here is the bridge from the theoretical to the practical, the praxeological. the realm of the ethical, where I make this newly acquired understanding my own. I understand as my own most possibilities of living, this being in the world, this authentication of my own most being in the world, to think about Heidegger, but also to go beyond Heidegger vis-a-vis the other, and thinking about the demands of justice. Justice is a big concept for Ricoeur. Justice vis-a-vis the other. To go further, we will later with Levinas in future videos, thinking about the call of the other and ethical responsibility for the other. But in any case, with phenomenology, we move toward an ethical response to what we have received, what we have interpreted, what we have described. And this involves some kind of reference to classical metaphysics, where we have to make a judgment, we have to take a stand, and no one else can substitute himself or herself for me, Donald Wallenfang. In my place, I am the one and only, even if someone has the same name out there in history. But I am an unrepeatable, unique, incommunicable self. And based on all that has been given to me in this phenomenological givenness and my risk of interpreting it, I am an embodied being. And so the ethical becomes inscribed in my own flesh, in how I live. And so my life becomes a living testament of the truth revealed through the phenomenological showing. So the second step of critique recognizes that something has been lost, irremediably lost, of pre-modern innocence. And is this not the historical situation in which we find ourselves today? We call it post-modernity. We can't live as if we assume the world is flat, for example. We can't live as if we don't find ourselves within a global village today. And the process of globalization is in full effect. And we can't help but be called into the responsibility of dialogue with the other, the racial other, the sexual other, the religious other, the economic other. Every other is a worthy interlocutor for conversation. And this is a Ricoeurian maxim, we could say. This process involves dialogue. We don't just critique ourselves by ourselves. Critique is when the self risks exposing him or herself to the other, who might know some more things, who might have some more evidence to share than the self has already found on their own. I mean, this is how we make advancements in medicine and every form of science, in philosophy, theology. Everything is through a community of contributors, where the lone individual is not sufficient for him or herself. So we recognize we can't go back to some golden era in history and just live like they lived hundreds of years ago with the same worldview, because we know too much. We've gathered up so much evidence as to more of what is the case, more of what is true, that we can't deny the evidence. That's unscientific. We expose ourselves to the evidence we may find in research, and we gather it up and we interpret it, we integrate it, we synthesize it. So critique prevents the pre-understanding from traversing along in ignorance by decentering its unchecked, unwarranted presuppositions, biases, and blind spots in favor of truthfulness, intellectual honesty, and actual objectivity. This is how Ricoeur puts it in Symbolism of Evil. That's what we're after: truthfulness, intellectual honesty, and objectivity. Again, the difference between doxa as opinion and episteme as knowledge of truth, of aletheia, as it revealed itself. We don't want to be simply sophists, carting around our own opinions, agendas, ideologies, self-interests for our own self-interested purposes. But the true philosopher, like Boethius in the Consolation of Philosophy, is disinterested. He's a disinterested investigator because this disinterestedness, where one has much skin in the game, is willing to risk his or her body, his or her flesh, his or her reputation, his or her paycheck for the sake of the truth, with the confidence that the truth will not disappoint, even if it leads to death, even if it leads to the shedding of one's blood. And that's the very concept of the martyr, the Greek word that means witness. The one who witnesses to running the risk of critique, to entering with confidence and grace the labyrinth of language, to slay the minotaur, to slay the illusion, the imposture, the counterfeit, including the death of the ego, which results in the life of the ego as well as the other, the community. A community is built by its witnesses. So critique interrogates the pre-understanding, and we arrive at this intellectual honesty, truthfulness, and objectivity by submitting the pre-understanding to the scrutiny of hermeneutic rigor, including a hermeneutic of suspicion. In his book on Freudian philosophy, Ricoeur identifies three masters of suspicion, as he calls them: Freud, Nietzsche, and Marx. And he says, you know, these thinkers, even if we say, yes, they fail to think toward the whole, they get some things right. In terms of motivations, human beings tend to act for. Freud, the libido principle, sexual desire, pleasure in general, that human beings act for the sake of pleasure, enjoyment, Genuss in German, jouissance in French, and that there's this underlying sexual urge that drives people to do what they do. Is that true in many cases? Yes. Nietzsche, Friedrich Nietzsche, Willen zu Macht, the will to power. Do people act out of a desire to gain more power over other people, a libido dominandi, as St. Augustine called it, a lust for domination? Yes, he's right, in part. And Karl Marx, do people act for the sake of mammon, for material gain and wealth and possessions? Yes, he's right too, in part. So we have to take seriously this hermeneutics of suspicion, this threefold suspicion of Freud, Nietzsche, and Marx as part of the critique in order to purify the investigating ego of all of those kinds of self-interest. We have to come clean. Am I being an ideologue or a seeker of truth? There's a difference. There's a very important difference. Am I acting like a sophist or Socrates? Am I just pushing my own opinions, my own agenda to increase my opportunities for pleasure, my status of power, my material gain and possessions? Or am I more serious about something that transcends these, yet in some way includes them? So suspicion is part of critique, though we don't want to reduce critique to hermeneutics of suspicion. Critique also asks the question of meaning via the intricacies of symbolic and metaphorical disclosure, contextual orientation, and historical particularity. So there's room for allegory here. In pre-understanding, we tend to over-literalize things. We take things far too literally, and we take the self too seriously. And so critique needs to help to bring about a revision of interpretation that has the expansiveness to include symbolic and metaphorical discourse and disclosure. And so often when we're talking about limit experiences in life, which Ricoeur does, we turn to the symbolic, the metaphorical, the poetic, the artistic. And as Ricoeur said earlier, meaning is made. There's an element of poesis in the receptivity of manifest phenomena and the meaning making that happens in our interpretation and receptivity of them. Poieo from the Greek, to create, to make. There's meaning is made through this process of critique, and also having a historical consciousness, being attentive to the particularities of the givenness of phenomena and historical, cultural, social, even political contexts in which we are interpreting things and making judgments eventually in a metaphysical way. So a new yet unfinished understanding, the step 3, emerges from critique, reoriented, enlightened, illuminated, though still naive. It's why it's called second naivete. Still naive, insofar as hermeneutics never arrives at a point of rest, at a point of absolute certainty, of complete or total understanding. So that's an important thing. The Cartesian quest for epistemological certainty is bound to fail. And we always must come back to the humility of our naivete, the humility of our naivete that we still have much to learn. As Socrates talks about, the more I know that I do not know. The more I learn, the more I realize what I have left to learn. And this is a second naivete, this kind of humble epistemology. So post-critical understanding must be put through the wringer of hermeneutics, elucidated through the decanting of critique, refined in the fires of suspicion's kiln. An understanding of second naivete is the arrival at meaningfulness, where an event is surpassed by meaning through intentional exteriorization, where the student becomes the teacher, where the observer becomes the witness. This movement toward appropriation that involves an intentional exteriorization of the contemplative, theoretical interiority of consciousness in relation to givenness. So it's a movement of exteriority that brings us to the ethical. Without that centrifugal movement of exteriority, we remain enclosed in the centripetal bubble of interiority. And we want this bubble to be burst through the ethical effervescence of exteriority. That's what we're moving toward with Ricoeur. So reality is rewritten through an iconic metamorphosis in which a distance is opened between text and subject. New possible ways of being in the world are disclosed. And the key question is distilled as, what meaning does the phenomenon have for us? What meaning does the phenomenon have for me? I must appropriate it according to my own proprius, my own self, make it my own, take ownership of what I have contemplated, of the fruits that have been born through critique, and make it my own. What possibilities are opened for me now as the meaning is made my own. So thank you for your question, Sandeep. According to Nietzsche, will to truth works under will to power. Yes, for Nietzsche, again, that's his hermeneutics of suspicion, that everything is read through the lens of the Willenszumacht, the will to power. We can't, for Nietzsche, peel away from that. And there's a lot that we can gain from that observation. And with Ricoeur, we would say Nietzsche is partly right. And that's the distinction. So in Nietzschean terms, yes, the will to find truth is, we could say, subsumed beneath the will to power. It's a function of the will to power. And what we're doing with Ricoeur is submitting Nietzsche's critique to another critique. Is it possible to critique the critique of Nietzsche? And where does that get us? How do we critique the critique of Nietzsche? Not through Nietzsche, but through other thinkers like Marion. Marion has some wonderful essays about Nietzsche and the will to power. We can critique each master of suspicion vis-a-vis the other. They're not all saying the same thing. So Freud could say to Nietzsche, what about the libido principle? The will to pleasure, you could say. And Marx could say to Nietzsche, what about the will to possessions? The will to material goods? And so critique is always an operation. It's always meant to be an operation for philosophy. Even for the most critical thinking, we could say, what is the critique that needs to be leveraged against critical theory? And what happens then? The point of critique is to bring us into greater contact with the whole. So no philosophy or school of philosophy has a monopoly on critique, even if a school is called that. The critics. So we want to take Nietzsche seriously. We want to read him and think along with him, but also we want to relate him to a greater whole. That's the danger of falling in love with one philosopher or another, as if we think what they have to say is the gospel. And the gospel, as the meaning of the term, for philosophy, as we're gathering up all these fragments, has to do with pursuit of the whole, where there's ongoing critique, there's ongoing humiliation, there's ongoing exposure, there's ongoing vulnerability within the adventure. And again, I just love the image of Tolkien's Lord of the Rings and Gandalf inviting Baggins out of the hobbit hole. Come on an adventure. And he's like, I don't want to go on an adventure. I'm content with what I have here in my hobbit hole, with this pre-understanding in my hobbit hole. You never know what the weather might bring with critique. And word on the street is it can be a hurricane, it can be a hailstorm, it can be all these things. And I don't want to expose myself to these unpredictable elements. But is this not the essence of philosophy? So with Ricoeur, we risk the question, what meaning does the phenomenon have for me? This question leads to the final step of appropriation. Here, the movement toward the ethical. And again, in this book, I argue that we don't get at phenomenological ethics without this phenomenology of proclamation that we see moving through Heidegger to Gadamer to Ricoeur to Levinas to Derrida. Deconstruction is part of critique, unmasking unwarranted assumptions and claims, claims without backing, claims without evidence. They're going to be subject to critique. And one of Ricoeur's favorite places for observation of phenomenological dynamics was the courtroom, where you have the plaintiff and the defendant and the lawyers, the sophists, the judge, the jury, the evidence. It's all so very interesting. The hermeneutics of the legal phenomena, the stuff of law, the stuff of crime and punishment, the stuff of innocence and guilt. All of these things come to surface in the interrogation and the critique of the courts. That's where we have to face the music of the evidence, and may the evidence come to surface that needs to bear on the truth of what happened. So appropriation, we move toward the ethical responsibility. Aneignung is the German word, appropriation, Aneignung, to make it my own, to make the meaning my own, and to become its witness. And this signifies a playful transposition of the text, whereby what was initially alien is made one's own. Event is surpassed by meaning only to become event again, the event of appropriation. So Ricoeur talks about this in Hermeneutics and the Human Sciences. And it's important to know that for Ricoeur, that this distinction between event and event of discourse. So there's the event of the phenomenon, self-manifestation, is one thing, and this event of discourse or meaning that moves toward appropriation is another. So there's a doubled eventfulness within the phenomenological matrix of the phenomenon that gives itself, and the interpreter become witness to what gave itself. So Ricoeur refers to the event meaning dialectic, the manifestation as event and meaning as event of interpretation and appropriation. So a dialectic. He's referring specifically to the event of discourse overall. However, he seems to expand the notion of event of discourse to refer to any event experience in general. We see this, for example, in his book, Interpretation Theory, where he writes that my experience cannot directly become your experience. An event belonging to one stream of consciousness cannot be transferred as such into another stream of consciousness. Yet, nevertheless, something passes from me to you. Something is transferred from one sphere of life to another. This something is not the experience as experienced, what Edith Stein would call a primordial experience. It's not transferred directly as a primordial experience through empathy, for example, but the meaning can be transferred one to the other. And that's event of discourse. Here is the miracle, Ricoeur says. The experience as experienced, as lived, remains private. It's experienced in solitude, but its sense, its meaning can become public through attestation, through narrative, through storytelling, through communication. And he says communication in this way is the overcoming of the radical non-communicability of the lived experience as lived. This is why we love to communicate with each other. If I experience something very profound, I have to tell somebody. I want to share it. I want to write about it. I've got to talk with someone about what I experienced, maybe show some pictures if I took pictures. I want to show them the evidence of the givenness, of the meaning and the meaningfulness of what I experienced. And this act of communication overcomes the solitude and solipsism of the self who experiences alone. And this is why in Heidegger, we can have a kind of lonely philosophy that it becomes really concentrated in Dasein. He'll talk about intersubjectivity to some degree, but not to the degree that Ricoeur is getting at here. Because the event, Ricoeur says, is not only the experience as expressed and communicated, but also the intersubjective exchange itself, the happening of dialogue. Dialogue is a key term for Ricoeur. And it's so interesting. The fruitfulness of dialogue is such that dialogue gives to the self more than it can give to itself by itself alone. When there is an interlocutor, when there is a conversation partner, that conversation partner can show the self more even about the self's own experience than the self can gather up on its own. And this is the beautiful art of communication, of speaking and listening, in which there's a real event of paideia, the Greek term, of pedagogy, a bearing of a fruit, a third coming on the scene, the generation of meaning through the course of dialogue. It's lighting up, it's giving itself more through this intersubjective rendezvous. So finally, in his book, Freud and Philosophy, Ricoeur says that a meaning that exists as a meaning caught up within a body, a meaningful behavior, that this can be the case in appropriation. Every enacted meaning is a meaning caught up within the body, where text becomes flesh. Every praxis involved in meaning is a signifying or intention made flesh, if it is true that the body is that which makes us be as existing outside of ourselves. So this is the great gift of having a body, is that the body is oriented to the exterior. The eyes look out, the ears listen out, all the senses. Perception perceives the world. At the same time, there's an inversion of all of this through interiority, a looking within, we could say, the very meaning of intellection, to read within the self. But it's still an intellection that happens vis-a-vis alterity, vis-a-vis the otherness of the phenomenon, the other of the other person facing me, and the movement of interpretation of what has given itself. The flesh, the body, allows us to exist, from the Latin existere, to stand outside of ourselves, through that process of appropriation and attestation, living attestation of the meaning received. This is the paradox of phenomenological meaning, that its givenness is received to the degree that it is exteriorized, that it is given up, given out, given over, shared, given away. Meaning is received to the degree that it is given away. And Ricoeur helps us understand this truth. So one last matrix we want to think about together in this current live stream has to do with what we could call the hermeneutic circle of appropriation. How is it that we begin with a pre-understanding and move beyond it toward this second naivete, new moment of understanding that has been exposed to the gauntlet, the labyrinth of language, the gauntlet of critique? So we want to think about this now together, and that is the hermeneutic circle of appropriation. How does this work? Moving from that pre-understanding and an original event of meaning, moving toward appropriation and attestation and discourse. So first we begin with an event. And it's a twofold meaning of the term event. As I said with Ricoeur, we start with an event, the givenness of the phenomenon, and the meaning making that happens in the human subject's interpretation of the phenomenon. So there's the event of manifestation and the event of meaning. Both of these form a unity for Ricoeur in the original event that we call phenomenon. So this moves us toward, second, the meaning of the event surpasses the event itself through distanciation. So we have the unfolding of meaning in relation to the contemporaneity and reciprocity of manifestation. So we have these two, a cleavage between the two in the second step, where meaning itself becomes, in a sense, extracted from the original experience, able to be shared. So I can't, as a human subject, reproduce the manifestation I received in givenness. It's like it was just for me. It was just for me in the lived experience, and I can't get at that for you. I can't share that with you directly. But what I can share is the story, the narrative, the discourse, through dialogue. And so the meaning then becomes extracted and now in circulation through this process of distanciation. And now the distanciation of meaning itself that is not owned by either interlocutor. The meaning itself has a life of its own through the process of distanciation, whether we're talking about any text, any narrative, any communication about meaning received, become, a meaning originally given, meaning received, meaning shared, now moves us toward the appropriation of meaning, wherein meaning becomes action. So relying on Heidegger very much here for this language of appropriation, meaning is appropriated by the human subject, not just as fact, not just as datum, not just as given, not just as text, not just as something interesting, not just etwas als etwas, not just something as something, but now something for me, something potentially for you, where the meaning itself, we could say, is digested by an embodied interpretive agent, the human person, and the appropriation, the meaning becomes action, lights, camera, action. And it's a meaning not only said, but lived. It's a meaning that becomes inscribed in the flesh of the protagonist of this meaning. That's what's meant by appropriation. Again, the Latin proprius, own, one's own. I make the meaning my own through the evidence of action. The proof is in the pudding. The meaning is in the morality. The meaning comes into view, comes through to be communicated through the great cloud of witnesses that are involved in the action, what Hans Urs von Balthasar calls the theodrama, the theodramatics of life, of discipleship, disciples of truth and meaning. This is awesome. This is big. But there's one more step before we complete the circuit, and this is where, I've already hinted at it, we move from appropriation to attestation. Attestation of meaning. Attestation of meaning. So if we're to number kind of the sequence, 1, 2, 3, 4. The attestation of meaning is when action becomes a new event of discourse. When the action itself becomes an embodied meaning, but also thereby, very similar to the meaning here, a new event of discourse that lights up the origin, the beginning, you could say, of the hermeneutic circle. But for Ricoeur, it's not like a hamster in a wheel circle where we get nowhere. It's an ever-expanding circle through that process, moving from first naivete through critique to second naivete, through appropriation to attestation. And so we have the gradual dilation of both givenness and meaning through its incarnation in persons. That is what is happening here. So we can see this much more full picture of phenomenology we have moving from Husserl to Heidegger, Marion, Ricoeur. And again, one of the biggest critiques of Marion's phenomenology is it's not Ricoeurian enough. It's not hermeneutical enough. He'll talk about in passing and the force of givenness that gives rise to an infinite hermeneutic. But can we do a phenomenology of hermeneutics? Can we do a hermeneutical phenomenology? That is Ricoeur, that is Derrida, that is Levinas, that is Gadamer. And we need these thinkers to complete the full picture. So altogether here, we have this event of appropriation moving toward attestation. And yet, it could be said that the eventfulness of appropriation is surpassed again by meaning, namely the attested meaning of the life of the one who is doing the appropriating of meaning. In other words, our lives become texts and bear an indelible character of action, communicated in the forms of language, symbol, and testimony. So this is where a human life becomes a living testament of meaning, and we have to deal with that. Thanks for your question, Imran. So does Ricoeur concede that there is any non-conceptual content in the experience of manifesting phenomena? Does he have an aesthetic theory relative to explication? He relies on the more developed aesthetics of like a Heidegger uh, uh, to say those things. So Ricoeur will admit, like in the Symbolism of Evil in that book, that there is this primordial nonverbal event we call it manifestation in phenomenology, and so he'll admit that. Yeah, he'll concede that there is an originary. I don't know that he go far to say fundamentally non-conceptual content, because we can't recognize a phenomenon without concepts. So he's with Kant on this point, that interpretation will involve conceptualizing the givenness, but Ricoeur does admit that there is this nonverbal primordial givenness, but he doesn't admit it for long. He says even maybe theoretically we can admit this, but that in our given historical context, we don't have the privilege of going back to the future, so to speak, back to the past. We don't have a time traveling machine where we can place ourselves in the first century, second century, prehistoric times, and have this privilege of I think what Husserl would like to try to do in the 20th century and now 21st century. So we don't have long to receive something completely non-verbally, non-conceptually without interpretation. For Ricoeur, we are immediately involved in the thicket of interpretation from the word go. And again, what I call in this book, it's a phenomenology of proclamation. And I would link that to what we could call a philosophy of adulthood. What's being said here assumes a certain cogitatio that's developed. Ricoeur's philosophy is not talking about little children, but we need that too. And that's where we'll look to a Merleau-Ponty, a Marion, and a Husserl. So this is key for Ricoeur. And we want to round this out by saying that our lives become texts and bear an indelible character of action. Ricoeur never loses sight, though, of the ontological concern for the genealogy of being, from text to action and back again, within this hermeneutic circle. So this is where Ricoeur is a bit different than Husserl, Heidegger, and Marion. Husserl, Heidegger, and Marion all want to bracket classical metaphysics out of the project of phenomenology. Ricoeur wants to turn to classical metaphysics, wants to recuperate ontology in the middle of modernity. Not many people are willing to attempt that, to risk that. So Ricoeur, like in his book with Andre, what's the last? It's called Thinking Biblically. Ricoeur, in this book, Andre Lecoq, this book, Thinking Biblically, it's very interesting. Ricoeur critiques Marion in that book, thinking about in the Hebrew scriptures, Exodus chapter 3, Ehyeh, Asher Ehyeh, I am who I am, and that we can't gloss over the power, the ontological metaphysical power of that kind of divine revelation, that self-revelation. As a phenomenon, Ricoeur does not follow suit that we need to bracket all things metaphysical. And he's not necessarily importing metaphysics into phenomenology, but what he's saying is, in order to make a judgment of action after all of this phenomenological sifting has been done, we need the ground, the anchor of metaphysics to do so. And the Seinsfrage has to come back in, not in just an exclusive Hegelian way, but in an Aristotelian way. Ricoeur is one of those few thinkers in the 20th century who dares to bring together classical metaphysics and phenomenology within the totality of his thought. And others would be Dietrich von Hildebrand, Max Scheler, Ada Stein, Karol Wojtyła, Karl Rahner, Hans-Urs von Balthasar, Hedwig Conrad Martius. There are some here. But metaphysics is part of it. We can't make an ethical judgment and take a stand on the witness stand without metaphysical footing. So that's all implied here. And even though we're thinking about it mostly in terms of phenomenology, there still is a genealogy of being in the Seinsfrage that's getting worked out through this phenomenology. And to prevent phenomenology from drifting into what could be called phenomenalism in its own kind of reductionistic fantasy worlds, we have to come back to the anchor of reality that has to do with being qua being itself and beings, substance, form, spirit, matter, hylomorphism, all these things, though we can separate that project from the one of phenomenology, but as John Paul II says, phenomenology helps reopen classical metaphysics in this postmodern situation, a recuperation of a clear genealogy of being. And as Imran says, it seems that faith in the external metaphysical reality of the things we explicate is what allows Ricoeur to hold interpretation, moving toward truth instead of collapsing in perspectivalism. Exactly. And this is why some of Husserl's students became critical of him, even while he was still alive. Adolf Reinach was one. Ada Stein was one. Hedwig Conrad Martius. They were concerned that Husserl was becoming an idealist like Kant and Hegel. And they were worried that we're losing touch with reality. They're like, that's why we came to study with you in Göttingen. Well, wasn't that the point of the Göttingen circle, objectivity? And here you are moving into a very idealist world of thought because he was concentrating so much on the interiority of subjectivity. And it became lopsided in Husserl as he kept trying to concentrate that phenomenological reduction, that quest for givenness. And in some ways, Husserl opens to intersubjectivity, into some kind of ethical inklings, empathy a little bit, but still it's such an intensified phenomenology of manifestation that he doesn't quite have all these hermeneutical pieces. And that's why we need Ricoeur to come along and help to resituate us in this Sitzem Leben that is part and parcel of our phenomenological experience. Finally, to round things out, I want to mention in this book, I end up putting together what I call a trilectic of testimony, studying the history of phenomenology, the phenomenology of manifestation, the phenomenology of proclamation, attestation. So what we have here is a paideia, a phenomenological paideia, a fecundity, when we have the distanciation happening between manifestation and proclamation, contemplation and ethics, and the fruit that is born is attestation. Attestation of the irreducible dialectic between manifestation and proclamation. And this can be applied within religious experience also. It's a kind of heuristic device to think religious experience. What's happening here in this place of worship, in this place of prayer? Do we have a predominance of manifestation or proclamation? To what degree of each? And where does this take the witness within the tradition? So, according to the model of this trilectic of testimony, as I call it, we have a perpetual manifestation, proclamation, attestation trilectic. And this is where manifestation is the event of givenness. Proclamation is the eventfulness of meaning and interpretation. And testimony is event and meaning together, a unity. A third party comes on the scene, witnessing to, again, the indissoluble alterity and dialectic between manifestation, proclamation, given, interpreted, contemplation, ethics. So this process, again with Ricoeur, can be described this way. We have originally an event occurs. We call the phenomenon giving itself. An event occurs. Second, the event is rendered meaningful and intelligible in and through language. The distanciation between the manifest phenomenon and the meaning through the labyrinth of language. Third, we have the meaning of the event as appropriated by an ethical subject, the meaning becoming incarnate in the life of a person. And fourth, then that life of the person as witness, as martyr at the extremity of appropriation and attestation becomes a living testimony, a text of action, the word becoming flesh that gives itself over as meaning to be interpreted and appropriated anew as a new event of phenomenological givenness. So through this progressive process, being makes its way through the conduits of manifestation, proclamation, and attestation. Events and meaning, and events again. So Ricoeur's attention to the fullness of language and to the layers of interpretation involved in every phenomenological experience ultimately challenges the presuppositions of Husserlian idealism. And this attempt to arrive at the purity of the phenomenon through the purification of the ego, the natural attitude. But Ricoeur says, be careful that another kind of natural attitude doesn't slip in a kind of phenomenological fundamentalism, that this too needs to continue to undergo relentless critique to avoid a kind of idealism or empiricism or fundamentalism or relativism or phenomenalism. So we need to get back on the ground. We need to remain grounded through this methodological dialectic that brings phenomenology back into dialogue with classical Metaphysics. So this is Paul Ricoeur. I welcome any other comments and questions within this live stream at this time. Thanks so much for your presence, for being part of this dialogue and discussion. There's always the option too of posting comments, questions in the comment section after the video is published. Right after this, I always love to hear from you. This being said, Paul Ricoeur, Hermeneutic Circle. Again, this is a big payoff in studying Ricoeur. We didn't see this in Husserl, Heidegger, Marion, but the work that Husserl and Heidegger did would set up Ricoeur to complete the circuit of phenomenality. So it's very exciting. And as I said, someone nearby Ricoeur in this phenomenology of proclamation is Emmanuel Levinas. We will have many more videos to come on his work. We'll have many more on Marion. We'll come back to Marion and all of this. But I find Ricoeur's thought so helpful, so interesting to round things out, to round out our understanding of phenomenology, of how it works, and to become even better philosophers than we were yesterday. That's exciting, that we are willing to expose ourselves to the gauntlet of critique, the labyrinth of language, with the full confidence that we have the weapon needed to slay the Minotaur. Because in philosophy, in our pursuit within this adventure, our pursuing truth, it's not just apologetics. We're on the offense, and we have the ball. And the truth calls us, it beckons us, it summons us. And we want to respond with great responsibility by the gift that it gives. So thank you, Imran, again. Did Ricoeur have influence from semioticians other than Saussure to inform his understanding of semiosis? Yes, definitely. When we look at his footnotes, his bibliography, he's gathering up the best of all thinkers. And I don't have them off the tip of my tongue, but I remember reading Symbolism of Evil, The Voluntary and the Involuntary, Interpretation Theory, Figuring the Sacred, Semiotics. He has a whole, I remember reading an essay about semiotics, and I'm less familiar with all the semioticians, so to speak, but you mentioned Saussure, and yes, he is very much in conversation with all of that. Thank you, Michael, for the thank you. And yeah, again, I think even going back to Wilhelm Dilthey, who's a kind of precursor early on to what happens in phenomenology, there's this attentiveness to hermeneutics, to the Geisteswissenschaften, the natural, not just natural science, Naturwissenschaften, but Geisteswissenschaften, the humanities, the spiritual sciences, and the nexus of meaning through which every scientific enterprise takes place. And this is what we are experiencing in the United States today. It's very sad that the humanities are being amputated from university life. I used to work at a university where, because of financial constraints, the subject matters to go are things like language, literature, philosophy, music, the arts, history, and even theology from religious affiliated schools gets amputated too. And then we're left with, just like what's called STEM, natural science, technology, engineering, mathematics. For all the values of these, they start to miss the fullness of meaning meaningfulness, truth. Like, we're not robots after all. We're human beings, and so we need the humanity. So there's a little plug for the humanities, not because I teach in the field, but because all of us around the world have to witness to the fullness of our humanity and where our questions take us, which is far beyond a closed world of empiricism, even though that has its place within the whole empirical sciences. But we're in this open world of investigation, all the way to where the deepest questions we ask take us. Who am I? Who are you? What is the meaning of life? Why am I here? Where did I come from? Where am I going? What is the meaning of all of this? That in no way could be reduced to some political program, pragmatic project, or ideology, or even philosophy. So all of this must be gathered up and integrated toward the whole. So thank you again so much. It means so much, your presence, your interest, and we'll continue to pump out these videos with new topics, more on Ricoeur next concerning metaphor and symbol, and more on testimony and attestation, and we'll work our way toward Levinas. Again, we'll come full circle back to Marion. I want to do more with his book, The Erotic Phenomenon, and so many more great topics. So yeah, it'd be sad to see the questions go. Cloistered only to seminarians, right? So that's the key, and I think philosophy forms the bridge between the sacred and the secular. It's a very important role of philosophy to do that we don't partition these worlds, because young people today are being led to believe that you have to choose one or the other, God or science. And true thinkers are saying, of course not. It's not a choice like this. These things are not mutually exclusive. But thinking toward God results in the best science, and the best science will involve questions that those parameters of biology, chemistry, physics cannot answer on their own, but needs to pass the ball to philosophy and then eventually theology. So this is exciting work we get to do in philosophy, because like I said, when it comes to the labyrinth, it's unicursal. It's not envisaged as bicursal or multicursal where we get trapped. But the labyrinth, according to the logos principle of Ricoeur, going back to someone like Justin, the martyr in the 2nd century, who said the logos of philosophy is the logos of theology. The logos is the same. We have a common stock of reason in which all true knowledge is rooted. Michael, thanks for your comment. You wish you had David E. Clem's The Hermeneutical Theory of Paul Ricoeur from the previous video. Ebook would have done it. Yeah, it's a great book. I read it years ago, as I was putting my original dissertation together, which was long before this book came out. And it's a great book. David E. Clem, I think he taught at, maybe it was Iowa University or something, but an excellent book to help understand Paul Ricoeur better, Heidegger, Kant, all of this put together. So there's a lot of great, we might say, secondary literature to help us understand the better known, I guess, thinkers at this point in history. But Clem's book is definitely one of those great texts. So if you have no more comments or questions, thank you again. I invite us all to continue to think toward the whole, to pray from the heart, and to live as a witness. We'll see you on the next one.